Lucas Greystone stood by the window in his home office, gazing out at the perfectly trimmed lawn below. The golden glow of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the grass, a quiet reminder of the order he'd worked so hard to create in his life. At 38, Lucas had climbed his way up from humble beginnings to become one of Austin's top civil engineers. His rise had been steady and precise, just like the meticulous projects he managed. He turned back to his desk, where blueprints and schematics for a massive bridge sprawled across the surface. This bridge wasn't just another job, it was his magnum opus. If everything went as planned, it would be the crowning achievement of his career, a lasting monument to his skill and dedication. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before diving back into the work that had consumed every waking moment of the past few months. Hours slipped by unnoticed until the faint sound of the front door closing broke his focus. Lucas checked his watch. 10:30 p.m. Marissa was late. Again. With a sigh, he made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the living room. He found her in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge. "You're home late," he said, leaning against the doorway. Marissa jumped, clearly startled, then turned to face him. At 34, she still had the kind of beauty that turned heads. Her practiced realtor smile was firmly in place, but behind her eyes, there was something else. A flicker of irritation or maybe guilt. "Hey," she replied, her voice a little too casual. "Yeah, I had a last-minute showing. You know how it is." Lucas nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on her. There had been a time when she looked at him with admiration, when he could feel her pride in everything he'd accomplished. Now all he saw was a mask, carefully constructed, unreadable. "So, how's the project coming along?" she asked quickly, eager to steer the conversation elsewhere. "It's coming along," he said, unable to hide the weariness in his tone. "We're making progress, but there's still a lot left to do." Her smile faltered for a second before she muttered, more to herself than to him, "There always is, isn't there?" The comment stung, but Lucas swallowed his frustration. He knew his long hours were taking a toll on their marriage, but couldn't she see how important this was? This project wasn't just a bridge. It was their future, the culmination of everything he'd worked for. He'd sacrificed so much to get here. He couldn't let anything or anyone derail it now. "I'm heading to bed," Marissa said abruptly, brushing past him without meeting his eyes. "Don't stay up too late." Lucas watched her leave, a nagging unease settling deep in his chest. Something felt off in Lucas's stomach, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it had been like this for a while now, lingering quietly in the background, but he shoved the feeling aside. There was work to be done. The next morning, Lucas was already at his desk, poring over blueprints, when he heard Marissa coming down the stairs. She was dressed in workout clothes, her sneakers squeaking softly against the hardwood floor. "Heading to the gym?" he asked without looking up, his focus still glued to the papers in front of him. "Yep," she replied, grabbing her keys and tossing him a quick glance. "I've got a session with my trainer." Lucas's head snapped up at the word. "Trainer?" Marissa shifted uneasily, her hand tightening around her keys. "Yeah, I've had one for a couple of weeks now. I told you about it, remember?" Lucas frowned. He was sure she hadn't mentioned it, but he let it slide. "Right. Well, have a good workout." She gave him a tight smile before heading out the door, and the sound of it clicking shut echoed in the quiet house. Lucas tried to return to his work, but his concentration was shot. The word trainer looped in his mind, each repetition stirring something uneasy in him. He shook his head, telling himself he was overthinking it. Marissa was allowed to have her own life outside the house. There was no reason to doubt her. And yet, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it refused to stop growing. At the gym, Marissa scanned the weight area, her heart beating a little faster when her eyes landed on Ryder Kane, her trainer. His sculpted frame and easy confidence caught the attention of almost everyone in the gym. As soon as he spotted her, his face broke into a grin, all charm and swagger. "There's my favorite client," he called out, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Ready to feel the burn?" Marissa flushed, her cheeks warm. She tried to play it off casually. "Let's just get to work," she said, brushing past his enthusiasm. But as they started their session, Ryder's hands lingered just a little too long when he adjusted her form. His compliments, initially professional, began to take on a different tone. Flattering, personal, and just a little too suggestive. "You're looking incredible, Marissa," he murmured as she finished a set of squats. "Your husband doesn't know how lucky he is to have you." She should have shut it down right there, drawn a clear boundary. Instead, she found herself soaking in the attention. It was a spark she hadn't felt in a long time, and Ryder's words filled a void Lucas hadn't even noticed. "Lucas is busy," she said after a pause, her voice carrying a faint edge of bitterness. "He's always busy." Ryder's eyes gleamed with something dangerous, a mix of intrigue and audacity. "His loss," he said smoothly, stepping closer. "What do you say we grab a drink after this? Celebrate all your hard work." Marissa hesitated, her wedding ring suddenly feeling heavy and cold on her finger. She knew she should say no. This was a line she couldn't cross. But then the thought of another night in their big empty house, sitting alone while Lucas buried himself in work, made her feel unbearably hollow. "Sure," she heard herself say, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "Why not?" Hours later, Marissa found herself at an upscale downtown bar, a cocktail in her hand and laughter spilling from her lips. Ryder sat across from her, spinning one amusing story after another, his grin as magnetic as ever. Ryder was everything Lucas wasn't. He was carefree, attentive, and full of thrilling stories about his wild adventures. Marissa found herself leaning in, captivated by his charm. "I still can't believe you're married to that stiff shirt," Ryder said, his tone light but edged with disdain. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A woman like you deserves excitement, passion." Marissa hesitated, the sting of his words softened by the warmth of the cocktail in her hand. She knew she should defend Lucas, stand up for her husband. But the alcohol was dissolving her inhibitions, and Ryder's attention felt like a drug she couldn't resist. "Lucas used to be different," she said quietly, almost as if confessing a secret. "When we first met, he was so driven, so ambitious. I admired that about him. But now he just takes me for granted." Ryder's expression darkened, his hand grazing hers on the table. The touch was deliberate, intimate. "He doesn't know what he's got," Ryder murmured, his voice low and smooth. "You're a free woman, Marissa. You can do whatever you want, with whoever you want." Her breath hitched as his words hung in the air between them. Looking into Ryder's intense, confident eyes, she felt a dangerous pull. And in that moment, Marissa made a choice that would change everything. Back at home, Lucas sat in his office, staring at his phone. The home security app had just sent him a notification. Marissa had arrived home, far later than usual. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he was overthinking it. Maybe traffic had been bad. Maybe she'd run an errand. But the gnawing dread in his gut wouldn't let up. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. Over the next few weeks, the unease grew harder to ignore. Marissa seemed distant, her temper shorter than usual, and she was spending more and more time away from home. Lucas told himself it was just stress, that their lives would go back to normal once the bridge project was done. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. It was the little things that gave him pause, things he couldn't explain away. The faint trace of an unfamiliar cologne clinging to her clothes. The way she clutched her phone whenever he was near, like it held secrets she couldn't let him see. The subtle but deliberate changes in her appearance. New clothes, a fresh hairstyle, like she was trying to impress someone. Lucas wasn't a man prone to wild suspicions or jealous fits. His career had taught him to deal in facts, to build a case on solid evidence. So that's exactly what he began to do. Methodically, quietly, he started gathering information. He installed tracking software on their shared devices. He set up discrete cameras in the house. He even went so far as to hire a private investigator to follow Marissa on the nights she claimed to be working late. All the while, Lucas played it cool, never once letting on that he suspected anything. Lucas Greystone wasn't the type to act on impulse. When he made a move, it would be calculated, backed by undeniable proof. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Marissa stood in front of the bedroom mirror, putting the finishing touches on her makeup. She was wearing a dress that hugged her figure in a way Lucas hadn't seen in years. Far too revealing for the casual work event she said she was attending. From the doorway, Lucas watched her silently, his expression unreadable. "You're going to that party tonight?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. Marissa flinched at the sound of his voice, spinning around to face him. Her hand flew to her necklace, an unconscious gesture of nervousness. Yeah, she said, her tone a little too bright. "I told you about it, remember?" Lucas tilted his head slightly, his gaze unblinking. "I remember." The room filled with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of his stare pressing down on her. Finally, she broke eye contact, mumbling something about needing to leave before she was late. As she brushed past him, Lucas stayed rooted in place, his jaw tightening. He'd been patient, methodical, and careful. But tonight, he knew, would be the night he'd finally act. Marissa fumbled with her lipstick, dropping it onto the vanity. "Yeah, it's just a work thing," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up, couldn't meet Lucas's gaze. "Why?" Lucas's voice was calm, too calm. He stepped further into the room, his tall frame seeming to fill the space. "Marissa," he said, his tone low and deliberate, "I'm not blind. If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back and find everything the same." For a moment, her eyes flickered with something. Fear, guilt. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by defiance. "I'm a free woman, Lucas," she shot back, her voice sharp and bitter. "I can do whatever I want. You don't own me." Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, his piercing gaze fixed on her as she grabbed her things and stormed out of the room. The slam of the front door echoed through the house. Alone now, Lucas allowed himself a cold, calculated smile. The trap was set. It was only a matter of time before he sprung it. At the rooftop party, Marissa tried to drown her unease in the pounding music and steady flow of drinks. Lucas's warning still lingered in the back of her mind, but she shoved it aside, focusing on the chatter and laughter of her colleagues. She was mid-laugh when a familiar voice cut through the noise. "There's my girl," Ryder called out, swaggering toward her with a drink in hand. His steps were uneven, his smile sloppy. He was already tipsy, his usual cocky confidence cranked up by the alcohol. Marissa's stomach twisted in a mix of excitement and dread as he approached. She knew she should keep her distance, especially with her colleagues watching, but Ryder had a way of drawing her in. "You look smoking hot tonight," he said loudly, his eyes raking over her shamelessly. "Bet your husband doesn't even notice. Does he?" Marissa flushed, acutely aware of the curious glances from her coworkers. "Ryder," she hissed, trying to rein him in, "keep it down." But Ryder was beyond subtlety now. He laughed, waving her off like she was overreacting. "Oh, come on, baby. It's not like it's a secret. Half the gym probably knows by now." The blood drained from Marissa's face. The situation was spiraling out of control. She opened her mouth to protest, to salvage whatever dignity she had left, when a sudden hush fell over the crowd. It was like all the noise had been sucked out of the rooftop. Marissa turned, her heart plummeting into her stomach. Lucas stood at the entrance. He was dressed in a sleek black suit that seemed to drink in the light, his presence radiating an icy authority. His face was a mask of fury, cold and unreadable, as his sharp gaze scanned the crowd. Then his eyes locked onto her and Ryder. Marissa's breath hitched. Her pulse roared in her ears as Lucas began walking toward them, each step deliberate, purposeful. Ryder, oblivious to the danger, puffed out his chest and swaggered toward Lucas. "You got a problem, man?" he slurred, his words heavy with drunken arrogance. He jabbed a finger in Lucas's direction, grinning like an idiot. "Relax, dude. I gave her a taste of what I can do. You should be thanking me." The crowd collectively held its breath. Marissa felt the world slow around her, everything blurring except for the man she had betrayed and the one who had been her accomplice. She wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but she was frozen in place, paralyzed by the gravity of the moment. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any threat Ryder could have imagined. In one smooth, controlled motion, Lucas closed the distance between them. His movements were precise, unhurried, and utterly terrifying in their calmness. Ryder, emboldened by the alcohol and his own reckless bravado, squared up as if ready for a fight. "What, you think you can just walk in here and—" Lucas cut him off with a single, measured step forward, forcing Ryder to stumble back slightly. The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of Lucas's controlled fury making the onlookers shrink away. "You gave her a taste of what, exactly?" Lucas said, his voice as sharp and cold as a blade. The quiet menace in his tone sent a shiver through the crowd. Ryder faltered, his swagger crumbling under the intensity of Lucas's glare. I was just joking, man," he stammered, his confidence draining away. He glanced around, as though looking for an escape route. Lucas tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "Funny," he said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper. "I'm not laughing." The silence was suffocating. Marissa felt like the ground beneath her was about to give way. She opened her mouth to intervene, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her mind racing. Before Ryder could say another word, Lucas leaned in close, his voice so low only Ryder could hear it. "You think you're untouchable. But men like you, they always fall. Hard." Ryder's eyes widened, his confidence completely shattered. He took an unsteady step back, his drink sloshing in his hand. "Hey man, I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, backing away further. Lucas straightened, his gaze still locked onto Ryder like a predator sizing up prey. "Leave. Now." Ryder didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled away, muttering incoherently, his bravado in tatters. The crowd parted for him, watching in stunned silence as he fled the scene. Lucas turned his attention to Marissa. His cold, calculating expression didn't falter as he approached her, each step deliberate and heavy with purpose. She felt small under his gaze, the weight of his disappointment and anger crushing her. "Lucas, she started, her voice trembling. "Save it," he said sharply, cutting her off. His voice was quiet, but it carried the force of a hammer. "We're leaving. Now." Marissa didn't argue. She followed him silently, her mind racing as they descended the stairs and stepped into the cool night air. The car ride home was suffocating, the silence between them louder than any shouting match could have been. When they finally arrived home, Lucas stopped at the door, his hand resting on the handle. Without turning to face her, he said, "Go upstairs. Pack a bag." "Lucas, please. Now." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Marissa's legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs, each step a painful reminder of the choices that had brought her here. As she reached the bedroom, she glanced back down at Lucas. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was the end of everything they had built together. And Lucas? He wasn't a man to let a betrayal like this go unanswered. Before anyone could react, Lucas's hand shot out, grabbing Ryder by the throat with a vice-like grip. With a force that seemed almost effortless, he slammed Ryder to his knees. Gasps rippled through the rooftop crowd, but no one moved, frozen by the sheer intensity radiating from Lucas. Then came the sickening crack. Lucas's fist connected with Ryder's face, the sound reverberating across the rooftop like a gunshot. Ryder crumpled to the ground, unconscious, his body sprawled in a heap. For a long, agonizing moment, Lucas stood over him, his chest rising and falling steadily, his face still an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated fury. Without a word, Lucas turned and walked away, the silence behind him deafening. Marissa stood frozen, rooted to the spot as humiliation and terror coursed through her veins. She glanced around at the stunned faces of her colleagues and friends, their shock cutting deeper than any words could. In that moment, with sickening clarity, she realized her life as she knew it was over. Lucas descended in the elevator, his movements smooth and deliberate. As the doors closed, a grim smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Phase 1 was complete. Now, it was time to dismantle Marissa's world piece by piece, just as she had shattered the life they had built together. Forgiveness wasn't an option. Reconciliation wasn't on the table. Marissa had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. Lucas Greystone was not a man to be betrayed, not a man to show weakness or mercy. Stepping into the cool night air, Lucas's mind raced through the next steps of his plan. His career, the bridge project, his reputation, all of it would survive and thrive. He'd worked too hard to let anything derail him. But Marissa would learn the true cost of her betrayal. The drive home was silent, the tension in the car thick and unrelenting. Lucas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The events of the party played on a loop in his mind, each replay stoking the cold fury simmering in his chest. When he pulled into the driveway of their suburban Austin home, he allowed himself a single deep breath, letting the night air fill his lungs. He needed to be calm, controlled, ruthless. Emotion wouldn't serve him now. He stepped inside the house and immediately set to work. With mechanical precision, he began gathering Marissa's belongings. Clothes, jewelry, personal items, and piling them neatly by the front door. Each item was a symbol of the life they had shared, now reduced to nothing more than baggage waiting to be removed. As he worked, he pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer. "John," he said, his voice icy and composed. "It's Lucas. File the papers." There was a pause as John responded. "Yes, now," Lucas continued, his tone brooking no argument. "And freeze the accounts. All of them, just as we planned." Another pause. "No," he said flatly. "There's no need for a cooling-off period. I have everything we need. Let's move forward." He ended the call and returned to his task. By the time he heard the crunch of tires on the driveway, a mountain of Marissa's possessions was already waiting near the door. Lucas positioned himself in the foyer, arms crossed, his posture firm and unyielding. He waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the sound of a key turning in the lock broke the stillness. The door creaked open, and Marissa stumbled inside, her face tear-streaked, her mascara smudged into dark streaks of regret. She froze in place the moment her eyes met Lucas's. The reality of what she had done hit her like a freight train. Lucas's voice was low, calm, and lethal. "You made your choice, Marissa." Her lips parted, a weak, trembling protest forming on them. But Lucas cut her off before she could speak. "You're no longer welcome here." He gestured toward the pile of her belongings by the door. "Take your things and leave." Marissa's shoulders shook as she struggled to form words, but the weight of Lucas's gaze left her speechless. "This is over," Lucas said, his tone final. "And so is your place in my life." He turned away without another glance, his footsteps echoing down the hall as he left her standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making. Marissa froze in the doorway, her eyes darting between Lucas and the neatly stacked pile of her belongings by the door. Panic flashed across her face as reality set in. "Lucas," she started, her voice trembling, "we need to talk about what happened." "There's nothing to talk about," Lucas cut her off, his tone sharp and unyielding. His voice was calm, but it carried a chilling finality. "You made your choice, Marissa. Now you'll deal with the consequences." Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, just let me explain," she begged, her voice cracking. "It didn't mean anything, I swear. Ryder was just... Get out." Lucas's voice lashed through the air like a whip, leaving no room for argument. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried again. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "This is my home too." Lucas let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Your home," he repeated, his voice laced with venom. "You gave up any right to call this your home the moment you decided to lower yourself for that gym rat." The words hit her like a slap. Her eyes flashed with anger, momentarily overriding her tears. "You bastard," she hissed. "You think you can just throw me away like this? I have rights." Lucas's gaze hardened, a dangerous glint flickering in his eyes. He took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "Call your lawyer," he said evenly. "I'm sure they'd love to see the evidence I've gathered, the hotel receipts, the text messages, the video footage. Go ahead, Marissa. Fight me. See how that works out for you." The color drained from her face, her anger giving way to disbelief. "You've been spying on me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas shrugged, completely unfazed by her reaction. "I prefer to think of it as protecting my interests." His words were clinical, devoid of emotion. "Now, for the last time, get out of my house." With trembling hands, Marissa began gathering her belongings, fumbling as she tried to manage the bags. Lucas stood motionless, making no move to help her. His impassive gaze followed her every step, cold and detached. When she finally managed to load everything into her car, she turned back to him, tears streaking her face. Her voice broke as she pleaded, "Lucas, please, we can fix this. We've been through so much together. Goodbye, Marissa." His tone was final, his face devoid of any trace of softness. He closed the door in her face without another word. As the engine of her car roared to life and faded into the distance, Lucas stood in the silent house, allowing himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Phase 2 was complete. In the days that followed, Marissa's world began to crumble with dizzying speed. When she tried to check into a hotel, her credit cards were abruptly declined. A call to her bank left her reeling. The accounts had been frozen, pending legal proceedings. Her cell phone service was cut off without warning, leaving her scrambling to figure out her next steps. With nowhere else to turn, she was forced to check into a dingy, run-down motel on the outskirts of town, relying on the dwindling cash in her wallet. The humiliation was unbearable, each passing moment a reminder of how far she had fallen. The cracks in her carefully constructed world widened into gaping chasms, and she realized too late that Lucas had planned it all with ruthless precision. She wasn't just losing her home or her marriage. She was losing everything. On the outskirts of town, Marissa sat alone in the dingy motel room, the dim light casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. It was the dead of night when her phone rang, the sound jarring in the oppressive silence. She grabbed it hastily, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Greystone," the voice on the other end began, formal yet tinged with sympathy. "This is Alan Parker. I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding your divorce proceedings." Marissa's grip on the phone tightened. "What is it? What's happened?" she demanded, her voice unsteady. Alan's voice crackled through the line, calm but grim. "Your husband has presented a significant amount of evidence. Texts, emails, video footage. I have to be honest. It's quite damning. That's an invasion of privacy." Marissa protested, her voice rising in panic. "He can't just—" "I'm afraid he can," Alan interrupted gently but firmly. "Everything was obtained legally. And there's more. He's invoking the infidelity clause in your prenuptial agreement." The blood drained from Marissa's face. Her stomach turned to lead as she whispered, "What does that mean?" Alan hesitated, his voice softening. "It means, legally speaking, you're entitled to a nothing. No alimony, no share of the assets. You walk away from this marriage with only what you brought into it." The phone slipped from Marissa's numb fingers, clattering to the stained carpet below. Her vision blurred as the weight of Lucas's revenge came crashing down. She wasn't just cast out. She was ruined. All she had left was regret and the realization of how meticulously Lucas had dismantled her life. Meanwhile, Lucas buried himself in his work, the bridge project becoming both his sanctuary and his obsession. Days and nights blurred together as he threw every ounce of his energy into calculations, designs, and site plans. The emptiness of his house no longer mattered. The bridge was his focus, his purpose. He ignored the whispers that swirled around the office, the concerned glances of colleagues who speculated about his private life. He brushed off their pity with the same cold efficiency he applied to everything else. One evening, as he bent over a set of blueprints in his office, a knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see David, his project manager, lingering awkwardly in the doorway. "Come in," Lucas said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. "What's on your mind?" David hesitated, his hands nervously clasped. "Lucas, we're all a bit worried about you," he began carefully. "You've been working non-stop, and after everything that happened with Marissa, my personal life is none of your concern." Lucas cut him off, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. David flinched but pressed on. "The project's on schedule, yes," he said quickly, "but—" "Then there's no problem," Lucas said flatly, his steely gaze pinning David in place. "So long as the project stays on track, that's all that matters." David opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He nodded instead. "Right. Just take care of yourself. Okay?" Lucas gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Was there anything else?" "No, that's all," David murmured before retreating out the door, glancing back one last time as if he wanted to say more. As the door clicked shut, Lucas leaned back in his chair, staring at the blueprints in front of him. A flicker of emotion, a crack in the armor he'd built, rose to the surface, but he crushed it down, burying it beneath layers of logic and focus. Emotion wouldn't help him now. He didn't need sympathy, or pity, or anyone meddling in his life. All he needed was the bridge. Lucas had settled into a predictable rhythm. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The weeks blurred together as he drowned himself in his routine, ignoring the world outside. The occasional texts or emails from Marissa came like clockwork, each one more desperate than the last. He deleted them without hesitation, never bothering to read them. Her voicemails met the same fate. As far as Lucas was concerned, Marissa Greystone no longer existed. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when the confrontation he'd been avoiding finally arrived. Lucas was in the backyard, methodically trimming the hedges, his movements precise and unhurried. The soft creak of the gate opening drew his attention. He turned to see Marissa standing there. She was a shadow of her former self. The polished, designer-clad woman he once knew was gone, replaced by someone wearing worn jeans and a faded t-shirt. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung limp and unkempt around her face. "You can't be here," Lucas said, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "There's a restraining order in place." Marissa took a hesitant step forward, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Lucas, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Just hear me out. What you're doing. It's cruel." Lucas folded his arms, unmoving. "Cruel?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think I'm the cruel one here?" "I made a mistake," Marissa continued, her voice breaking. "I know that. But a mistake." Lucas scoffed, his voice dripping with disgust. "Is that what you call sleeping with another man for months? Lying to my face day after day? A mistake? I was lonely," Marissa cried, her words tumbling out in a rush. "You were always working, always focused on your precious career. I needed something, someone." Lucas's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "And instead of talking to me, instead of even trying to fix things, you chose to betray everything we built together." His words sliced through her excuses like a blade. "You made your choice, Marissa. Now live with it." Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed to her knees, her sobs racking her body. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, her voice raw. "What am I supposed to do? You've taken everything from me." For a brief moment, Lucas's face flickered, a shadow of something, pity, guilt, crossing his features. But just as quickly it vanished, replaced by cold resolve. "That's not my problem anymore," he said flatly, turning away. "Please," she choked, reaching out as if he might soften. Lucas stopped, his back still to her. "You should leave before I call the police." Marissa flinched at his words, rising shakily to her feet. Defeated, she turned and made her way back toward the gate. But before she stepped through, Lucas's voice cut through the stillness like a whip. And Marissa, he called out, his tone sharp, almost cruel. If I were you, I'd start looking for a job. I hear the diner on 5th is hiring waitresses. The devastation on her face as she looked back at him was a grim satisfaction Lucas hadn't realized he'd been craving. She had destroyed his world. Now she was feeling the same pain, the same loss, tenfold. Later that evening, Lucas sat in his empty living room, the only light coming from the dim glow of the whiskey glass in his hand. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He stared at the amber liquid, his mind swirling with the wreckage of the past weeks. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. He picked it up and frowned at the unknown number. His stomach sank as he opened the message. Lucas, it's Ryder. We need to talk. This has gone too far. Call me. Lucas's hand tightened around the glass, his jaw clenching as he stared at the screen. The audacity of the man, after everything he'd done, was almost laughable. Almost. Setting the glass down, Lucas leaned back, his mind already turning over the next move in this game he hadn't planned on continuing to play. A humorless smile curled on Lucas's lips as he stared at the message. So, the great Ryder Kane had finally gathered the nerve to reach out. A little too late for that. Without hesitation, Lucas typed a brief response. There's nothing to talk about. Enjoy the consequences of your actions. With a swift motion, he blocked the number and tossed his phone onto the table. He picked up his whiskey and took another deliberate sip, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. Let Ryder stew in his mess. Let him feel the crushing weight of his choices, just as Marissa had. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas watched from a distance as the fallout of the affair continued to unravel. Ryder's once thriving gym business took a nosedive as whispers of the scandal spread through the community. Female clients, in particular, began canceling their memberships, their trust in him shattered. The man who had once been so cocky and untouchable was now scrambling to salvage his reputation, his confidence replaced by desperation. Marissa fared no better. Stripped of her real estate license due to the scandal, she was forced to take a job as a waitress at a dingy diner. Lucas heard through the grapevine that she tried reaching out to her well-off family for support, only to be turned away. They were more concerned with avoiding public disgrace than helping their disgraced daughter. Through it all, Lucas stayed focused. The bridge project, his legacy, was entering its final stages, and he poured every ounce of his energy into ensuring its success. His colleagues had learned not to bring up Marissa or his personal life. To them, Lucas Greystone was no longer just a man. He was a machine, cold, efficient, and unstoppable. It was a crisp autumn morning when Lucas stood at the base of the completed bridge, the culmination of years of planning, dedication, and sacrifice. City officials, members of the press, and onlookers gathered around as he cut the ceremonial ribbon, officially opening the structure to the public. For the first time in months, Lucas allowed himself a rare moment of genuine pride. This was it, his legacy, his mark on the world. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. Mr. Greystone, she began, her voice eager. This project has been hailed as a masterpiece of modern engineering. How does it feel to see it completed? Lucas paused, choosing his words carefully. Finally, he said, it feels right. This bridge represents years of hard work, dedication, and unwavering commitment. It's proof that with the right focus and determination, you can overcome any obstacle. The crowd burst into applause. Lucas's gaze swept over the sea of faces, his expression composed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw her, Marissa. She was standing at the back, watching him with a mixture of longing and regret etched into her features. But when he looked again, she was gone, if she had ever been there at all. Later that evening, Lucas sat in his office, scrolling through the press coverage of the bridge's opening. The articles were glowing, filled with praise for his vision and leadership. He took a sip of his whiskey, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He glanced up to see David, his project manager, lingering hesitantly in the doorway. Got a minute, boss? David asked, his tone cautious. Lucas nodded, gesturing for him to come in. What's on your mind? He asked, his tone neutral but firm. David sat down, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I just wanted to say congratulations on the bridge. It's a hell of an achievement. Thank you, Lucas replied evenly, sensing there was more to come. David hesitated, then took a deep breath. Look, I know it's not my place, but are you okay? I mean, really okay? Lucas considered brushing off the question with his usual cold efficiency, but there was something about David's genuine concern that made him pause. I'm managing, he said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. The work helps. David nodded slowly. I get that. But, Lucas, there's more to life than work. What happened with Marissa? It's awful, no question. But holding on to all that anger, that need for revenge, it's not healthy, man. Lucas felt a flare of irritation and leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. I don't recall asking for your opinion on my personal life. I know, David said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. I'm probably overstepping here, but someone had to say it. You've changed, Lucas. You've become colder. I'm worried about you, that's all. For a long moment, Lucas said nothing, his gaze unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was quiet but firm. I appreciate your concern, David, but I'm fine. What happened with Marissa, it's done. Over. I've moved on. David looked like he wanted to push further but decided against it. He stood, nodding reluctantly. All right, just remember you've got people who care about you, okay? Don't shut everyone out. As the door closed behind him, Lucas turned to face the window, his reflection pale and ghostly in the darkened glass. Had he changed? Become colder? Perhaps. But he had survived. He had thrived. And he had done it all without compromising who he was or what he believed in. In the end, that was all that mattered. Lucas stood at the window of his office, watching the sun sink below the Austin skyline. The bridge stretched out before him, illuminated by the fiery hues of twilight, a testament to his skill, his determination. As darkness fell, the bridge's lights flickered on, casting a glow over the water below. It stood as a beacon of progress and achievement. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Come in, Lucas called, not turning from the window. David entered, holding a stack of papers in his hands. Got the final reports on the bridge project, boss. Everything's in order. We're officially done. Lucas nodded, finally turning to face him. Good work, David. You and the team should be proud. David hesitated, shifting on his feet before speaking again. Listen, Lucas. There's something else. I overheard some of the guys talking. Apparently, your ex-wife has been asking around about you. Lucas's jaw tightened. Marissa? His voice was clipped. What does she want? David shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. Not sure, but word is, she's in pretty bad shape. Lost her job at the diner, can't make rent. Some people are saying. He hesitated, glancing at Lucas's expression before continuing. Some people are saying she's been sleeping in her car. The room fell into a heavy silence. Lucas's face remained impassive, but his grip on the edge of the desk tightened ever so slightly. Thank you for letting me know, he said finally, his voice unreadable. David nodded and left, the door clicking shut softly behind him. Lucas stood there for a long moment, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. The weight of David's words hung in the air, pressing against him. Slowly, he returned to the window, his gaze fixed on the glowing bridge in the distance. Marissa's choices had led her here. She was living the consequences of her betrayal. But as the minutes ticked by, Lucas couldn't shake the faint, unwelcome flicker of something. Not pity, not guilt, but something that unsettled him all the same. The briefest flicker of something, pity, maybe, crossed Lucas's face, but it vanished before David could notice. Is that so? Lucas said evenly, his tone betraying nothing. Well, I'm sure she'll figure it out. She always does. David shifted uneasily, sensing the finality in Lucas's words. Right? Well, I'll leave these reports with you. Have a good night, Lucas. As the door clicked shut behind him, Lucas stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the window. He tried to focus on the bridge outside, its illuminated frame a reminder of his triumph, his hard-earned success. But Marissa's face kept forcing its way into his thoughts, an irritating thorn he couldn't shake. With a frustrated grunt, Lucas grabbed his keys and headed out the door. The streets of Austin were eerily quiet as Lucas drove, his mind restless, wandering without purpose. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay in the house with the weight of those thoughts pressing down on him. Without realizing it, he found himself driving through Marissa's old neighborhood. He passed her favorite coffee shop, a small, familiar corner of their past. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, ready to move on, when something familiar caught his eye. There she was. Marissa sat alone at an outdoor table, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands. Even from a distance, it was obvious how much she had changed. Her once stylish clothes hung awkwardly on her thin frame, and her hair, usually so polished, was a tangled, dull mess. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had pressed her into the ground. She looked broken. Before he could stop himself, Lucas pulled the car over and stepped out. Marissa looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in shock and fear. "Lucas," she stammered, her voice wavering. "What are you doing here?" Lucas stood there for a long moment, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully name. Finally, he spoke, his tone cold and measured. "I heard you've been asking about me." Marissa's hollow laugh cut through the night air. "Checking up on me? Making sure your revenge is complete?" "It's not about revenge," Lucas replied sharply, his tone hard as stone. "It's about justice. You betrayed me, Marissa. You threw everything we built together into the trash." Tears welled up in Marissa's eyes, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "I know. God, Lucas, I know. And I've been paying for it every single day. Isn't that enough? Haven't I suffered enough?" For a brief moment, a flicker of pity stirred in Lucas's chest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a woman far removed from the Marissa he once loved. But he crushed the feeling, his resolve unshaken. "You made your choice," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you're stuck with it." Marissa's face crumpled, fresh tears streaking down her cheeks. "Please, Lucas," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I've got nothing left. No job. No home. My family, they've all turned their backs on me. I don't know what to do anymore." Lucas remained silent, his face an unreadable mask. Inside, conflicting emotions churned. A faint whisper of compassion drowned out by the cold certainty that this was the outcome of her choices. Lucas's expression remained unreadable as he stared at Marissa. When he finally spoke, his voice was icy. "That's not my problem, Marissa. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to cheat." He turned to leave, but Marissa called after him, her voice cracking with desperation. "What about Ryder? Did you ruin his life too?" Lucas stopped in his tracks, letting out a humorless chuckle. A whisper of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he turned back slightly. "Ryder destroyed his own life," he said coldly. "Last I heard, his gym's about to close down. Turns out women aren't too keen on trainers who sleep with married clients." With that, Lucas walked away, leaving Marissa sobbing at the table. As he drove home, he tried to convince himself that the encounter hadn't affected him. But no matter how hard he tried, a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd taken things too far. The following morning, Lucas threw himself back into work, determined to drown out any lingering doubts. He buried himself in new projects, his focus razor-sharp. He was deep into a conference call when his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Greystone, but Mr. Kane is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Lucas's anger flared at the mention of Ryder Kane's name. The sheer audacity of the man. "Tell him to leave," Lucas snapped. "If he's still here when I come out, I'll have security escort him off the premises." Before his assistant could respond, the door burst open, and Ryder stormed in. The once confident trainer was unrecognizable, a disheveled, unshaven mess with dark circles under his eyes. His shoulders were slumped, and his movements lacked the cocky energy that had once defined him. "You bastard," Ryder growled, his voice raw with rage. "You've ruined everything. My business, my reputation. It's all gone because of you." Lucas rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate, his voice calm but deadly. "I didn't ruin anything, Ryder. You did that to yourself the moment you decided to sleep with my wife." Without warning, Ryder lunged at him, grabbing Lucas by the shirt. His face was a mask of desperation. "It wasn't like that," Ryder shouted. "Marissa came on to me. She was lonely, neglected. I was just—" Lucas broke Ryder's grip in one swift, effortless motion and shoved him back with a fierce glare. "Just what? Being a good friend." His tone dripped with contempt. "Don't insult my intelligence, Ryder. You knew exactly what you were doing." Ryder stumbled backward, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "What do you want from me, man?" he said, his voice laced with defeat. "An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I screwed up. But this," he gestured wildly, his voice breaking, "this scorched earth campaign of yours. It's too much." Lucas let out a cold, bitter laugh. "Too much? You destroyed my marriage, betrayed my trust, and now you have the gall to stand here and tell me I'm going too far? No, Ryder. This is just the beginning." "It was a mistake," Ryder shouted, desperation edging every word. "People make mistakes, Lucas. Don't they deserve second chances?" For a long moment, Lucas simply stared at him, his eyes filled with cold contempt. His silence was louder than any words, a verdict that needed no explanation. "Not for me, they don't," Lucas said, his voice low and menacing. "Now get out of my office before I have you thrown out." Ryder hesitated, his shoulders sagging under the weight of Lucas's cold stare. Finally, he turned and slunk away, defeated. As the door slammed shut, Lucas sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Ryder had stood moments before. He should have felt triumphant, seeing the man who had helped destroy his life brought so low. Instead, all he felt was a gnawing emptiness. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of relentless work and sleepless nights. Lucas threw himself into new projects with a zeal that bordered on obsession. His colleagues couldn't help but notice the shift, the cold, impenetrable air that seemed to radiate from him. He spoke less, smiled even less, and shut himself off entirely from those around him. It was late one evening when David once again appeared at the door to Lucas's office. "Lucas, can we talk?" David asked, his tone cautious. Lucas looked up from his computer, irritation flashing across his face. "What is it, David?" "I'm busy." David stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "That's just it, Lucas. You're always busy. You never leave the office. You never socialize with the team. It's not healthy, man." "I don't remember asking for your opinion on my life," Lucas snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. David raised his hands in a gesture of peace. I know, but someone has to say it. You've changed, Lucas. Ever since what happened with Marissa." "Don't say her name," Lucas growled, his tone dangerous. David continued, undeterred. "Ever since the divorce, you've been different. Colder. More ruthless. It's like you've lost a part of yourself." Lucas stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I haven't lost anything, David. I just realized what really matters. Success. Achievement. Things that can't betray you. Things that won't let you down." David shook his head, concern etched into his features. "Is that really all that matters to you now? What about friendship? Love? Forgiveness?" "Forgiveness?" Lucas scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Forgiveness is for the weak. It's a luxury I can't afford." David's eyes narrowed, his gaze unflinching. "Can't afford," he pressed. "Or are you just too afraid to risk it?" For a brief moment, Lucas's mask slipped. A flicker of something, pain maybe, flashed beneath his icy exterior, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I think you should leave now, David." Lucas said quietly, his voice dangerously calm. David hesitated, one hand on the door, before turning back one last time. Just think about what I said, Lucas. It's not too late to choose a different path. The door clicked shut, leaving Lucas alone in the quiet of his office. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at his computer screen, but his mind was elsewhere. David's words echoed in his head, unshakable. Days passed in a blur, but Lucas couldn't rid himself of the nagging doubts that had begun to creep in. His focus wavered, and he found himself distracted, staring at old photos of Marissa on his phone. There she was, smiling in the warm glow of a summer afternoon, her laughter frozen in time. Lucas's chest tightened as he wondered, where had it all gone so wrong? She was now, huddled under a bus stop shelter, soaked to the bone and shivering against the cold. Lucas had been driving home from the office when he spotted her. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Without fully thinking, he pulled over. Marissa looked up as he approached, her wide eyes filled with a mix of surprise and fear. "Get in the car," Lucas said gruffly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic softness. Marissa hesitated, her gaze narrowing suspiciously. "Why? So you can gloat some more?" Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Just get in, Marissa. You're going to catch your death out here." Reluctantly, she climbed into the passenger seat, her soaked frame barely filling the seat. The drive was tense and silent, the weight of unspoken words thick in the air. Once inside Lucas's house, he handed her a towel and some dry clothes, old ones of his, from before the divorce, that he'd never gotten around to donating. Marissa disappeared into the bathroom to change, leaving Lucas alone in the living room. He paced, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. What the hell am I doing? He wondered. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to push her away, but something deeper held him back. When Marissa emerged, the sight of her caught him off guard. She looked smaller than he remembered, vulnerable in his oversized sweater, a stark contrast to the confident, polished woman she had once been. "Why did you bring me here, Lucas?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Lucas struggled to find the words. I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I saw you out there, and I couldn't leave you in the rain." Marissa let out a bitter laugh, her expression tinged with pain. "That's rich, coming from the man who left me with nothing." "You left me first," Lucas shot back, old anger rising to the surface like a dormant volcano. "You threw away everything. Our marriage, our future. For a fling with that gym rat." "I know," Marissa whispered, her tears flowing freely now. "God, Lucas, I know. And I've regretted it every day since. But what you did to me, the way you destroyed my life, my career, was it really necessary?" Lucas turned away, unable to meet her gaze. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You hurt me, Marissa, more than I ever thought possible. I wanted you to feel that same pain." Marissa's shoulders sagged, the weight of his words sinking into her. The last trace of hope seemed to drain from her face. "Well, congratulations, Lucas," she said softly, her voice hollow. "You succeeded. I've lost everything. My job, my family, my self-respect. Are you happy now?" The question hung heavy in the air between them, charged with the ghosts of their shared past. Lucas stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to feel the satisfaction he'd been chasing for so long. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, what he felt wasn't triumph. It was something far more complicated. As Lucas looked at Marissa, all he felt was an overwhelming sadness. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, I'm not happy." The admission seemed to shatter something unspoken between them. Marissa sank onto the couch, her body racked with sobs. Lucas stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, his emotions a chaotic tangle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sat down beside her, careful to leave some distance between them. I'm sorry, Marissa," he said hesitantly, his voice uneven. "Not for exposing the affair or filing for divorce, you deserved that. But for the rest of it, maybe I went too far. Marissa looked up at him, her tear-streaked face searching his for any sign of hope. Does this mean? Can you forgive me? Lucas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. No, Marissa, I can't forgive you. What you did broke something between us that can't be fixed. But maybe, he paused, exhaling slowly, maybe we can both try to move on. Let go of this anger, this bitterness, before it destroys us completely. Marissa nodded slowly, her expression softening. A glimmer of something, relief perhaps, appeared in her eyes. I'd like that, she whispered. They talked for hours, laying bare the years of pain and resentment that had festered between them. By the time Marissa left, Lucas felt a strange lightness, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. He hadn't forgiven her. He didn't think he ever could. But he had taken the first step toward letting go. The next day, Lucas called his lawyer. I want to revise the divorce settlement, he said. Set up a modest alimony payment for Marissa. Enough to help her get back on her feet. Nothing more. The lawyer paused, surprised. Are you sure? After everything that happened? I'm sure, Lucas replied, his tone resolute. It's not about forgiveness. It's about moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Lucas began to reconnect with the world he'd shut out for so long. He joined his team for after-work drinks, started mentoring younger engineers, and even entertained the idea of dating again. The pain of Marissa's betrayal still lingered, a dull ache in his chest, but it no longer consumed him. One evening, Lucas found himself standing on the bridge he had built, the crowning achievement of his career. He watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the city in hues of gold and crimson. As darkness fell, the bridge lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the water below. A sense of peace washed over him, quiet but profound. He had survived the storm of betrayal. He had come out the other side stronger. No, he hadn't forgiven her, and he likely never would. But he had let go of the bitterness that had once defined him. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. This time, Lucas would face it on his own terms, wiser, stronger, and free from the shackles of his past. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile.